On a quiet morning in Newport, Rhode Island, the ocean is calm. Waves roll in, slow and steady, against a line of gray rock. The town is still half asleep, but on the edge of the cliff, one building already dominates everything. A massive stone palace facing the Atlantic like it owns the horizon. This is Marble House. From a distance, it looks almost unreal. The pale stone walls, the heavy bronze doors, the rows of perfect windows. It feels like something that should be in Europe, not in a small American seaside town. Even now, over a century after it was finished, it still sends the same message it did on day one. Someone with incredible money and power lived here. But that's not the whole story. Because Marble House wasn't just a home. It wasn't a cozy family place or a normal summer retreat. It was a weapon, a statement, a challenge thrown down in front of the richest people in America. And it was built on a fortune that came from some of the harshest, most ruthless business practices of the Gilded Age. As we move closer, we see the scale of it. The giant stone steps, the carved details, the railings, the statues. Today, tourists walk around, taking photos, saying what most of us say. Wow, this is beautiful. But under that beauty, there's another story. A story of railroad workers and passengers whose money fed one of the biggest fortunes in American history. Of quarry workers and stonecutters who hauled and carved the marble that gives this house its name. Of servants who spent their lives climbing hidden staircases so that people upstairs could pretend work didn't exist. And at the center of it all, one woman, Alva Vanderbilt. She didn't just want a nice house. She wanted to crush the line between old money and new money. She wanted to force her way into a world that told her she didn't belong. Marble House was her answer. A palace on the cliff that shouted, "You can't ignore me." But even that victory came with a cost, not just for workers and staff, but for her own family, including a daughter who would be pushed into a loveless marriage so the Vanderbilt name could climb even higher. In this story, we're going to walk through Marble House room by room, story by story. We'll look past the gold and marble and ask questions that don't usually show up on the tour pamphlet. Who really paid for this place? How was the money made? And what did it cost the people who never got an invitation to the parties held here? We'll follow the story from the rise of the Vanderbilts to the construction of Marble House to the dramatic personal life of Alva, and finally to the way this building is remembered today, both as a glamorous Gilded Age mansion and as a monument to inequality. If you enjoy deep investigations into big houses, powerful families, and the hidden cost behind luxury, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep making long-form stories like this. Because Marble House isn't just about the past. It's a mirror. When you look close enough, you don't just see an old rich family from another time. You see questions that still matter right now. How far will people go to feel important? Who gets to live in the light? And who has to stay in the shadows so the dream can shine? This is the dark story of Marble House, the Vanderbilt palace built on ruthless fortune. The Gilded Age. When America was gold-plated, not golden. To really understand Marble House, we have to pull the camera way back. Before there were marble staircases and gold ceilings in Newport, there was something much less glamorous, a country tearing itself apart and then trying to rebuild. The Gilded Age roughly covers the years after the Civil War, from the 1870s to about 1900. On paper, it looks like a miracle. The United States industrialized at record speed. Railroads stitched the country together. Steel, coal, oil, and finance exploded into massive industries. Cities grew almost overnight. But the key word in Gilded Age is gilded, not golden. Gilded means covered in a thin layer of gold on the outside, no matter what's underneath. And that's exactly what this period was. A thin gold coating over brutal working conditions, political corruption, and extreme inequality. On the top layer, a small group of men became almost unimaginably rich. They ran railroads that could decide which towns lived or died. They controlled oil pipelines, steel mills, banks, and stock markets. Newspapers called them captains of industry. Their critics had another name: robber barons. The idea behind that nickname was simple. These men didn't just get rich by working hard. They got rich by squeezing everyone around them. They slashed wages and extended hours for workers. They crushed strikes by hiring private security or calling in state troops. They wiped out smaller competitors with price wars and secret deals. They used their money to buy influence in politics, shaping laws and regulations in their favor. It was a system where the people at the top were playing a very different game than everyone else. The Vanderbilt family became one of the clearest symbols of this new kind of power. The story starts with Cornelius Vanderbilt, known as the Commodore. He began as a tough, no-frills boat operator in New York and built a shipping empire by undercutting competitors and pushing himself and his crews hard. Later, he shifted into railroads, and that's where his fortune exploded. By the time he died in 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt had built one of the largest fortunes in American history. His railroads controlled key routes in and out of New York City and across major parts of the country. That wealth came from millions of passengers and tons of freight paying fares and fees. It came from workers laying tracks, engineering trains, maintaining engines, and doing dangerous, exhausting jobs. But when the money flowed upward, it flowed to one place: the Vanderbilt family. After Cornelius, his son William Henry Vanderbilt took over and doubled the fortune in less than a decade. He's the one famous for saying, "The public be damned," when asked whether his railroads should be run for the benefit of the people. That quote captures the mood of the age better than almost anything. Profit came first. Everything else came second. This towering pile of money eventually trickled down to the next generation, including William Kissam Vanderbilt, the man who would marry Alva and fund Marble House. By then, the Vanderbilts weren't just rich. They were rich, rich. The kind of rich where you could decide, I want a palace by the sea, and then just do it. But even for the Vanderbilts, there was a problem: social class. In New York, there was a tight circle of old money families who'd been wealthy and powerful for generations: the Astors, the Livingstons, the Schermerhorns, and others. To them, the Vanderbilts were newcomers. They might have more cash, but they didn't have the right kind of name. That's another key part of the Gilded Age story. It wasn't just about money. It was about respect, image, and power. Old money families saw themselves as the guardians of taste and tradition. New money families, like the Vanderbilts, were seen as flashy, loud, and a little crude, people who had skipped the line. So what did the Vanderbilts do? They built. They turned money into mansions, estates, and spectacular displays: big houses in New York City, grand country homes, yachts that were bigger than many people's apartment buildings. A lot of that building wasn't really about comfort. It was about sending a message. We belong here, we're not going away, and we can outdo you at your own game. Newport, Rhode Island, became one of the main battlegrounds for this quiet war. Once a simple seaside town, it turned into a summer playground for the ultra-rich. Families built massive cottages along the cliffs, and cottage was their joking term for houses that were basically private palaces. In this world, every house was a statement, every party was a performance, and every new building had to be more impressive than the one before. Marble House was born right in the middle of this arms race. It didn't appear out of nowhere as just a beautiful idea. It was the product of an age where fortunes were made in a harsh way, then wrapped in marble and gold to look noble and refined. When you look at Marble House, you're not just seeing the taste of one couple. You're seeing the story of a country that was growing faster than its ethics could keep up. A country where one family could pile up more wealth than entire towns, and then pour a slice of that money into a house they would only use for a few weeks a year. The Gilded Age made Marble House possible. And the darker side of that age, the ruthless side, never really left its walls. Alva and William, ambition, insecurity, and the need to be seen before Marble House was ever drawn on paper, there was Alva. And to understand why this building looks the way it does, why it exists at all, you have to understand her. Alva Erskine Smith was born in 1853, not into poverty, but into comfort. Her family had money from cotton and business ties that stretched from the American South to Europe. As a child, she got a taste of the good life: travel, education, exposure to culture. She knew what it felt like to be somebody. Then the Civil War and economic changes hit her family hard. The wealth shrank. The security she'd grown up with started to crumble. For a girl raised in that world, losing money didn't just mean losing stuff. It meant losing status, losing place, losing identity. That experience left a mark. By the time Alva's family moved into New York high society circles, they were no longer at the top of the food chain. They were orbiting around richer, more established families. And in that world, your future wasn't just about what you personally could do. It was about who you married. Enter William Kissam Vanderbilt. William was the grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt and the son of William Henry Vanderbilt. That meant one thing: he was carrying a massive, newly built fortune on his shoulders. The Vanderbilts had more money than many small countries. But in the social world of New York, that money was still new. To the old money families, the Vanderbilts were outsiders with good suits. Their wealth came from railroads and business deals, not from generations of land ownership and quiet, inherited power. They didn't have the right last names, the right ancestors, the right stories. For Alva, though, marrying into the Vanderbilts was a solution. It gave her security again. It gave her access to a level of money she never could have imagined. And it gave her something else she cared about just as much: a stage. When Alva and William married in 1875, they didn't just form a couple. They formed a kind of partnership in social warfare. William brought the cash. Alva brought the willpower and the vision. William himself was quieter than his wife. He enjoyed the lifestyle, the horses, the yachts, the traveling. He was a wealthy man who liked the comforts wealth provided. He wasn't known for sharp political views or a burning public mission. Alva, on the other hand, absolutely had a mission. She looked at the way old money families shut out the Vanderbilts and took it personally. There were drawing rooms she couldn't enter, parties she couldn't attend, women who treated her like she would never fully belong, no matter how large her husband's fortune was. That didn't sit well with her. So Alva decided to fight back in the language this world spoke best: spectacle. Her first big move came in 1883, when she threw one of the most famous parties in American history, a masquerade ball at the new Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue. This wasn't just a party. It was a carefully planned social invasion. The guest list was huge. The costumes were elaborate. The newspapers covered every detail. And crucially, Carolyn Astor, the queen of old New York society, wasn't on the list at first. According to the story, Mrs. Astor only received an invitation after she formally called on Alva, acknowledging her. In other words, the old queen had to come to the new princess. It worked. After that night, the Vanderbilts weren't just rich. They were in. But Alva wasn't done. Winning in New York was one thing. The next level was Newport. Newport was where the real summer status game played out. The biggest names in America built cottages there, each one trying to outshine the last. There were rules, spoken and unspoken, about who mattered and who didn't. Alva understood that in this environment, a house wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a weapon, a profile picture made of stone, a permanent social argument. So she went to William with a plan. They would build something in Newport that nobody could ignore. A house so large, so grand, so unapologetically European that it would feel like a piece of Versailles had been dropped on the Rhode Island coast. For William, this wasn't a hard sell. He had the money. He liked grand projects. And, like many wealthy husbands of the time, He saw building a huge house as a sort of acceptable hobby for his wife, something that kept her busy and impressed the neighbors at the same time. But for Alva, it was more than a hobby. It was about rewriting the story people told when they said the name Vanderbilt. No more sneers about new money. No more feeling like a guest in someone else's world. No more sitting outside the most exclusive circles, waiting to be noticed. Marble House would be proof that she understood taste, architecture, history, proof that Vanderbilt wealth could be dressed up in classical columns and marble halls and look just as legitimate as any old European noble's estate. Behind all the future glitter, there was something simple and almost raw. Insecurity. Alva knew what it was like to have money and lose it. She knew what it was like to feel looked down on. And she was determined that no one would ever put her in that position again. So when you see Marble House, you're not just seeing William's railroad inheritance turned into stone. You're seeing Alva's answer to a lifetime of being told she wasn't enough, not rich enough, not old enough money, not refined enough. The house on the cliff began as an idea in the mind of a woman who was tired of asking for a seat at the table and decided to build her own hall instead. Designing a temple to wealth, Marble House takes shape. By the late 1880s, Alva had her plan, and William had the money. Now, they just needed someone who could turn social ambition into stone. They chose one of the most famous architects in America, Richard Morris Hunt. Hunt wasn't just any architect. He had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the top school for classical European architecture. He understood palaces, monuments, and grand public buildings. He knew what made a house look royal, even if there wasn't a crown in sight. Hunt and Alva were a good match. She had a strong vision and strong opinions. He had the training and the ego to work on a project this huge. Together, they set out to do something bold. Drag a piece of European royal style onto the cliffs of Rhode Island. Their main inspiration was the Petit Trianon at Versailles, a small but elegant palace built for Louis XV's mistress and later used by Marie Antoinette. It wasn't the largest building at Versailles, but it was one of the purest examples of refined classical design. Alva loved that. Copying the Petit Trianon wasn't just about looks, it was about symbolism. Versailles was the ultimate palace of old-world monarchy. If Marble House could echo that, then the Vanderbilts weren't just railroad people anymore. They were playing in the same visual language as kings and queens. Construction on Marble House began around 1888. From the start, the scale was extreme. This wasn't, let's build a nice big home. This was, let's build a statement that will outlive us. The numbers tell the story. The house ended up with around 50 rooms. It covered roughly 140,000 square feet, more than enough to swallow up several normal houses. It cost about $11 million at the time, including the furnishings. That's the modern equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars. Around $7 million of that was spent just on marble. Try to picture that. More than half the budget going into a single material. Not the wood, not the brick, not the labor. Just marble. Hunt and his team pulled marble from several sources, including exotic types from overseas. Different rooms used different stones to create contrasting moods. Cool, pale marble in some spaces, and warmer, richly colored stone in others. From the outside, Marble House looks strict and controlled. Its front facade has a formal rhythm. Tall windows, heavy columns, a grand central doorway. It's balanced and symmetrical, like a drawing from a textbook on classical architecture. But once you walk in, the word controlled starts to feel wrong. Inside, the house explodes with decoration. You step into a high, sweeping entrance hall with marble floors and walls that almost feel like they're glowing in the right light. Above you, ceilings are covered in plasterwork, carvings, and painted details inspired by French palaces. The staircase is more than a staircase. It's an event. Stone steps curve up between thick balustrades, pulling your eyes toward more gilding, more carving, more detail. This is a place designed so that even walking from one floor to another feels like a show. The dining room is lined with rich, colored marble and heavy ornamentation, designed to impress guests before a single dish was served. The grand salon, the main reception room, is loaded with gold leaf. Literally. Thin layers of real gold pressed onto the surfaces of moldings and details, catching the light from crystal chandeliers. There's a Gothic room that feels like a dark, private museum, filled with medieval-style carvings and religious art. Here, Alva displayed her collection of Catholic and Gothic objects, which gave her a kind of cultural authority, proof that she had taste and knowledge, not just money. Everywhere you look, there is some kind of message. The marble says, "We have permanent wealth. This won't rot or decay." The gold says, "We are not afraid to use our money where everyone can see it." The scale says, "We are larger than life." And outside, facing the sea, the back of the house is just as intentional. Wide terraces, stone balustrades, and formal landscaping create long sight lines that draw your eye from the house outward toward the Atlantic. It's like the house is in conversation with the horizon, claiming the view the way the Vanderbilts claimed railroad routes. All of this was carefully planned. Marble House wasn't thrown together by a builder following a rough sketch. It was the result of detailed drawings, models, and constant back and forth between Alva and Hunt. She was deeply involved in decisions, from the overall layout down to many of the interior choices. To the outside world, that might have looked like simple perfectionism. But underneath, something else was going on. Alva wasn't just decorating. She was building armor. In a world where old money families judged every fabric, every piece of furniture, every architectural detail, Alva wanted nothing that could be mocked as cheap, vulgar, or second-rate. Hiring the top architect, importing materials, working in a serious European style, these were all ways to bulletproof her social standing. But there was a darker edge, too. Think about what it takes to make a house like this. Thousands of tons of stone. Carpenters, plasterers, metal workers, marble cutters, painters, decorators, gardeners. A whole army of specialized labor working for years to bring one couple's vision to life. They didn't all make headlines. Their names weren't splashed across society pages. Many of them were immigrants or working-class Americans earning modest wages, doing hard, physical work. Their labor was literally built into the walls. And the money paying for all of this? That came from railroads that had already become symbols of both progress and abuse. Tracks laid through small towns, land battles, rate wars, strikes and crackdowns. People far from Newport were living with the consequences of how that fortune had been made. Marble House, in other words, is not just an example of great architecture. It's a physical translation of an economic system. A system where money rose up from millions of people and gathered in the hands of a few, who could then crystallize it into stone, gold, and status. By the time the house was finished in 1892, Alva had what she wanted, a temple to wealth on the cliffs of Newport. It was a summer cottage that looked more like a royal residence. It was impossible to ignore. But the story doesn't stop when the last stone is set. In many ways, that's where the most interesting part begins. When we look at how all that marble got there, and what it meant for the people whose names never appeared on the invitations. The supply chain. Nobody saw quarries, stonecutters, and exploited labor. When you walk through Marble House today, the marble feels almost weightless. It's smooth under your hand, cool, clean, polished. It reflects light in a soft, flattering way. It's easy to forget that before it became decoration, it was rock. Real rock. Deep in mountains and hills, far from Newport, that rock started its life in quarries, open scars cut into the earth. If Marble House is the polished surface of the Gilded Age, the quarries are its raw, broken underside. In the late 1800s, marble was big business. Wealthy families wanted it for their homes. Banks, government buildings, and courthouses used it to show seriousness and stability. Architects like Richard Morris Hunt loved it because it connected their designs to the classical world of Greece, Rome, and European palaces. But none of that elegance changed the basic reality of how marble got out of the ground. Quarry work was brutal. Workers used drills, hammers, wedges, and sometimes explosives to break giant blocks of stone free from the earth. There were no hard hats, no steel-toed boots, no ear protection. You worked on ledges, on steep faces of rock, with heavy blocks suspended above you. If something slipped, there wasn't much between you and disaster. In many quarries, accidents were common. A dropped block could crush a leg or kill someone instantly. Dust filled the air. Over time, breathing in that dust damaged lungs and shortened lives. Long before anyone talked about occupational health, men were coughing their way through each shift, hoping to hang on just long enough to feed their families. The workers were often immigrants or poor locals. Italians, Irish, Eastern Europeans, people who had come to America chasing opportunity and ended up swinging tools in dangerous pits for low pay. Others might be second- or third-generation Americans with few other options. The job was good, only in the sense that it was work. Meanwhile, marble companies made their money on volume. The more stone they could pull, cut, and ship, the more profit they made. That pressure flowed directly down onto the workers. Longer hours, faster output, corners cut on safety. Any delay was costly, and the people at the top weren't the ones standing under hanging blocks of stone. From the quarry, the marble blocks were moved by teams of men and animals, and later by railroads, the same kind of railroads that had made the Vanderbilts rich. There's a dark symmetry in that. The rails that built the Vanderbilt fortune carried the stone that turned that fortune into Marble House. Once the stone reached cutting yards and workshops, another group of laborers took over. Stonecutters, carvers, and polishers turned rough blocks into columns, panels, fireplace mantels, stair treads, and decorative details. This was skilled work, but it was still harsh. Imagine standing for hours every day over stone and tools, hammering chisels, guiding saws, leaning into heavy pieces, guiding them into position. Dust and grit in the air, tiny chips of stone flying from every blow. A mistake didn't just cost money, it could cost your job or your fingers. Some of these workers were proud craftsmen with years of training. Others were newer laborers doing the grinding, repetitive tasks. But both groups shared one thing. They were mostly invisible to the people who would later walk across their work in ball gowns and polished shoes. When Marble House was being built, all of this labor blurred together into schedules and invoices. Architects and contractors signed off on shipments and measurements. The Vanderbilts saw numbers, bills, and samples. What they didn't see, or chose not to think about, were the men pulling 10- and 12-hour days in quarries and yards so that Alva could have the exact shade of stone she wanted in her dining room. And this wasn't happening in a vacuum. The late 1800s were full of labor unrest. Workers in mines, mills, railroads, and factories were organizing, striking, and protesting. They wanted shorter hours, safer conditions, and better pay. These movements were often met with violence, police crackdowns, private security forces, and, in some cases, the National Guard. The same country that was producing Marble House was also producing breadlines, unsafe tenements, and children working in factories. The same economy that let a summer cottage cost millions also forced workers to risk their lives to keep their families afloat. In some industries, employers used prison labor or other tightly controlled workforces to keep costs down. Even where that wasn't the case, the attitude was clear. Labor was just another resource. Stone, wood, iron, human beings, all part of the same supply chain. By the time a piece of marble reached Marble House, it had already passed through many hands and many risks. Someone had cut it out of the earth. Someone had loaded it. Someone had shaped it. Someone had polished it until it shone. But once it was installed, those people vanished from the story. Guests at Marble House didn't raise their glasses and toast the stonecutters. They didn't ask about the accident rate in quarries or whether workers had health problems from dust. They saw the marble as part of the background, a smooth surface meant to hold up the performance of wealth. That's the quiet cruelty of places like Marble House. The very thing that makes it so stunning, the endless stone, the feeling of solidity and permanence, is also a record of how far the Gilded Age elite were willing to go to turn money into status. They didn't have to know the exact names and faces along the supply chain. The system let them stay distant. They just had to sign the check. Today, we can admire the craftsmanship. It truly is impressive. The carved details, the joins, the way light plays off the surfaces. These are real achievements. But if we stop there, we're only seeing the gilded part of the story. The deeper part is this. Every smooth piece of stone in Marble House started out as something rough, heavy, and dangerous. Just like the Vanderbilt fortune itself, the marble's journey from quarry to palace was built on risk taken by people who didn't get to stand in the finished house and smile for the camera. The invisible army. Inside, servants who made the fantasy run. If the quarry workers and stonecutters built Marble House, the servants kept it alive. A house like this doesn't run on its own. It's more like a small hotel with a family living inside it. And a hotel needs staff. Lots of staff. At its peak, Marble House is estimated to have needed around 3 dozen servants to operate smoothly. That meant butlers, housemaids, ladies' maids, footmen, cooks, scullery maids, laundresses, coachmen, grooms for the horses, and later, chauffeurs. And that's before you count gardeners and other outdoor workers. Most of the time, these people are just a blur in the background of old photographs. A dark shape holding a tray, a figure standing by a carriage, the edge of a uniform cropping into the frame. But without them, the whole illusion of effortless luxury would fall apart in a day. Think about the scale of the work. Those marble floors? They had to be cleaned, polished, and kept free of footprints and dust. Those huge windows facing the sea? Salt air and weather would leave marks that needed constant wiping. The carpets, tapestries, and drapes? All magnets for dirt, ash from fireplaces, and wear from guests. The endless silver, crystal, and fine china. It had to be washed by hand, carefully, piece by piece, after every meal and party. Servants woke up early and went to bed late. Many of them lived in small, plain rooms tucked into the upper floors or back sections of the house, far from the glittering spaces guests saw. Their lives were defined by routines built around the needs and moods of the family upstairs. If the mistress wanted breakfast at a certain time, that meant kitchen staff rising much earlier to prepare it. If there was a ball or a formal dinner, days of work went into polishing, cleaning, arranging flowers, setting tables, and, afterward, cleaning everything back up again. The house was designed to make the servants invisible. Behind the grand corridors, there were back hallways where staff could move without being seen. Narrow staircases tucked away in corners allowed them to travel between floors out of sight. Service doors opened into rooms from hidden angles so a butler or maid could appear, do their job, and disappear again like a stagehand. Upstairs, guests saw a world that looked almost frictionless. Food arrived hot. Fires were already lit. Candles and later electric lights glowed when the sun went down. Beds were made. Clothes were laid out. Luggage was unpacked. Downstairs and behind the walls, it was all friction. Servants had to move quickly but quietly. They had to remember endless details, how each guest took their tea, what time a particular family member liked to bathe, which pieces of china were reserved for certain occasions. Mistakes were noticed, and corrections were not always gentle. For many servants, especially women, domestic service was one of the only ways to earn a steady income, especially if they were immigrants or came from poor families. They might send money home, help support siblings, or just try to stay afloat. Room and board came with the job, but so did a loss of privacy and independence. You didn't clock out at 5 in the afternoon when you lived where you worked. Alva was known to be demanding. She had an exact picture of how things should look and run. That kind of precision meant that staff had to constantly anticipate her standards, not just follow orders, but stay mentally a step ahead, so nothing looked out of place when she appeared with guests in tow. It's easy to imagine Marble House as a kind of machine, with the Vanderbilts at the top and servants as moving parts that kept the gears turning. When a bell rang in a hidden corridor, it was a signal that the machine needed attention. A guest wanted assistance. The dining room needed service. A carriage needed to be brought around. Servants walked a strange social line. They saw everything. Arguments, celebrations, secrets, stress. They knew which marriages were unhappy, which relatives were tolerated but disliked, which guests drank too much or treated staff rudely. But knowing was not the same as belonging. They were always close, but never equal. On paper, Marble House was a summer cottage, a place the Vanderbilts used for just part of the year. But for many staff members, the work was not seasonal in the same way. They might move with the family between homes, or stay on to maintain the property in the off-season. The building still needed care when the owners were gone. Leaks fixed, rooms aired, grounds kept up. So while high society floated in and out on trains and yachts, the servants' lives were tied to the slow heartbeat of the house itself. Today, tours of Marble House do sometimes mention the servants' quarters and the scale of staff needed. You might get a glimpse of a narrow hallway or a plain bedroom where someone slept between 14-hour days. But it's still easy to walk through the glittering rooms and focus on the upstairs story, the Vanderbilts, the guests, the parties. If you pause, though, and think about the dozens of hands that had to move in sync for everything to appear perfect, the house starts to look different. Every shining surface is a reminder of someone who scrubbed it. Every perfectly made bed is a reminder of someone who was already awake before the family opened their eyes. Every grand evening was built on the quiet labor of people who slipped in and out of sight, making sure the fantasy never broke in front of the guests. The invisible army inside Marble House didn't leave their names carved into the walls. But without them, the palace on the cliff would have been nothing more than a cold shell. Parties at the end of the world, gilded nights in Marble House. By the time Marble House was finished in 1892, it wasn't just a building, it was a stage. And Alva Vanderbilt knew exactly how to use it. In Newport, the summer season was short but intense. For a few weeks each year, the richest families in America flocked to the cliffs. Days were filled with yachting, horseback rides, tennis, and calls between houses. Nights were where the real competition began. This was a world where a dinner party could cost more than a worker's yearly wages, where fresh flowers might be shipped in daily, and where it mattered, really mattered, whether your ball was talked about more than your neighbor's. Marble House slid into that world like a knife. Imagine the approach on a party night. Carriages and later automobiles roll up the drive. Lanterns and electric lights glow against the stone. You can hear the ocean somewhere in the distance, but closer, you hear horses, wheels on gravel, the muffled sound of an orchestra tuning up. Guests step out in gowns and tuxedos, jewels catching the light. Servants move silently, taking coats, guiding people up the stairs and into the blaze of color and music. Inside, the house transforms. The grand salon, with its gold leaf and chandeliers, becomes a glowing box of sound. Strings, piano, laughter. The marble entrance hall echoes with footsteps and voices. The dining room table stretches under silver candelabras, crystal glasses, and carefully arranged food that was prepared in hot, crowded kitchens hours before anyone arrived. One of the most famous gatherings centered on Alva's daughter, Consuelo. Even before the official marriage arrangements that we'll get to in the next chapter, Consuelo's presence at Marble House drew attention. She was tall, graceful, and rumored to be one of the most eligible young women in America. Not just a person, but a symbol of the Vanderbilt fortune and what it could buy. Nights in Marble House could feel like a fantasy world. Costume balls where guests dressed as historical figures or characters from literature. Musical performances. Dances that went on past midnight. People stepped outside on the terraces between songs to breathe in the sea air, look out at the dark Atlantic, and then drift back into the glow. But like everything in the Gilded Age, that glow sat right on top of something darker. While guests at Marble House were sipping champagne and dancing under golden ceilings, the rest of America was dealing with real problems. Economic panics wiped out savings and closed businesses. Strikes over wages and working conditions turned violent. Farmers struggled with debt and low prices. Immigrants worked long hours in dangerous factories, trying to survive in overcrowded cities. Inside the walls of Marble House, those crises could feel very far away. The house was built to keep them out. Thick stone, carefully controlled entrances, staff who filtered what the family saw and heard. Newspapers might arrive, but they were just one more piece of information in a world centered on social calendars and personal dramas. Still, even inside this bubble, people could feel a kind of unease. The scale of the parties, the money spent, the pressure to impress, it all had a slightly frantic edge. Like everyone sensed at some level that the world outside was changing faster than the world inside these rooms. You can feel that tension in the way people talked about Newport. On the surface, it was elegance, sea breezes, yachts, tennis courts, and manicured lawns. Just under the surface, it was competition, insecurity, and a race to stay on top of a very narrow social pyramid. Marble House became one of the most powerful symbols of that lifestyle. When people criticized the idle rich, this is the kind of place they had in mind. A palace used for a few weeks a year, run by servants, built on money made from railroads and industry hundreds of miles away. On a party night, though, most guests probably didn't think about that. They thought about the music, the food, the people they were trying to impress or attract. They thought about what was being said in the corners and along the staircases, who was rising, who was falling, whose name was on everyone's lips. The house did its job. It made everything seem inevitable, permanent, solid, as if this way of life, this tiny world of balls and banquets, would continue forever, untouched by strikes, elections, wars, or changing times. Of course, we know now that it didn't. The same forces that built Marble House would, over the next decades, start to pull it and its world apart. New taxes, new politics, new values, and global conflicts. But at the height of its party era, none of that felt real yet. On those nights, under those lights, Marble House was not a museum. It was alive, full of music, gossip, ambition, and denial. A place where the richest people in America danced as if the cliff they stood on could never erode. Consuelo's sacrifice, when your daughter becomes a business deal. If Marble House was Alva's armor, her daughter Consuelo was her sharpest weapon. From the moment she was born in 1877, Consuelo Vanderbilt was treated less like a child and more like a future project. She had what her world valued: money behind her, beauty in front of her, and a last name that could open doors almost anywhere. But in Gilded Age, high society, daughters weren't just loved. They were leveraged. By the 1890s, a strange trade had developed across the Atlantic. American heiresses marrying cash-poor European aristocrats. These men had titles, ancestral homes, and long bloodlines, but many of them were broke, strangled by debt and the cost of keeping ancient estates alive in a modern world. American families like the Vanderbilts had the opposite problem. They had money, and lots of it, but not the old-world prestige that came with coats of arms and centuries-old castles. The solution, in the eyes of people like Alva, was simple. Swap. American dollars for European titles, new money for old names, daughters for dukes. Consuelo became one of the most famous examples. As a teenager, she was tall, stylish, and widely considered to be stunning. Newspapers and society columns talked about her as if she were a prize to be won, not a person with her own plans. Behind closed doors, though, her relationship with her mother was tense and often painful. Consuelo fell in love with someone else, a young American, not a duke, not a titled aristocrat. She wanted to marry for love, not strategy. To most modern ears, that sounds perfectly reasonable, but to Alva, it sounded like disaster. Alva had set her sights much higher. Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. The Duke had something Alva desperately wanted, a title tied to one of England's great estates, Blenheim Palace. Blenheim was enormous, historic, and incredibly expensive to maintain. The Duke needed money. The Vanderbilts had it. What followed has been described, in different versions, as emotional pressure, manipulation, and outright coercion. Consuelo did not want to marry the Duke. She begged to be allowed to marry the man she actually loved. She cried. She resisted. Alva pushed back harder. Accounts say she used guilt, threats, and even claimed she was seriously ill, that she might die, if Consuelo refused. In a world where daughters were taught to obey and where mothers could wield emotional power like a weapon, this wasn't a fair fight. In the end, Consuelo gave in. In November 1895, she married the Duke of Marlborough in a heavily publicized ceremony in New York. The press framed it as a fairy tale, the American heiress and the English Duke, a real-life storybook ending, the kind of match that made both families look powerful, strategic, and sophisticated. For Alva, it was a triumph. Her daughter had married into the British aristocracy. The Vanderbilt name was now tied to Blenheim, to dukes and dukedoms. Society watched, and many people admired her success. But for Consuelo, it was a cage. After the wedding, she moved to England and took up her role as Duchess of Marlborough. Life at Blenheim Palace was grand on the surface, but strict, formal, and cold. Her marriage to the Duke was not a love match, and the distance between them only grew with time. She did what she was expected to do, produced heirs, attended functions, moved through the routines of aristocratic life. But inside, she struggled. Later in life, she would describe feeling trapped, not just in the marriage, but in the expectations that had been placed on her since childhood. Back in America, Marble House stood like a physical reminder of the world that had pushed her into this deal. The same house where she had grown up, walked those marble halls, and watched her mother dominate the social scene was now tied, invisibly, to the price that had been paid: her freedom. It took decades for the truth to really surface. Consuelo eventually separated from the Duke and, over time, built a more independent life. She became involved in philanthropy and good works, especially during World War I, and slowly began to reclaim her own story. The most striking moment, though, came years later, when her marriage to the Duke was annulled. During that process, Alva herself reportedly testified that she had forced her daughter into the marriage, that she had pressured and coerced her to accept a union Consuelo did not want. Think about that. The same woman who had built Marble House to prove her own power and independence had used that power to strip her daughter of the right to choose her own husband. It's one of the darkest threads in the Marble House story. The idea that in the race for status, even your own children can become bargaining chips. On the outside, Marble House signaled triumph. On the inside, it was part of a pattern of control. The house had given Alva a platform, a throne, a way to demand respect from old money families. But it hadn't softened her drive. If anything, it sharpened it. Once she'd proven what she could build with stone, she moved on to building social alliances through her children. If the quarry workers and servants were the hidden cost in physical labor, Consuelo was the hidden cost in emotional terms, a living reminder that, for some Gilded Age families, loyalty and love came in second to strategy. When you see Marble House today and hear about balls and dinners, it's worth remembering this quieter story. Somewhere in those same rooms, a young woman once listened to her mother's plans and realized that her future was being mapped out like a business arrangement. The palace on the cliff didn't just shape the way outsiders saw the Vanderbilts, it also shaped how they saw themselves and what they believed they were allowed to do to their own family in the name of staying on top. Divorce, spite, and reinvention. Alva turns the palace into a platform. On paper, Alva Vanderbilt had everything she wanted. She had Marble House, her own palace on the cliff, proof to the world that she could remake herself from an insecure outsider into one of the most powerful hostesses in America. She had pushed her daughter into a title-bearing marriage. She had broken into the inner circle of New York and Newport society. But behind the gold ceilings and formal portraits, her marriage to William Kissam Vanderbilt was falling apart. The cracks had been there for a while. William liked his comforts and his freedom. He also liked other women. Affairs weren't unusual among men of his class, but Alva was not the type to quietly look the other way and accept humiliation just to preserve the appearance of a perfect marriage. By the mid-1890s, the tension between them had reached a breaking point. In 1895, something almost unthinkable happened in their world. Alva filed for divorce. Divorce in that era, especially for people at their level, was scandalous. It wasn't just a private matter. It was a public earthquake. Newspapers followed every development. Society whispered. Clergy judged. Many women in similar situations simply endured unhappy marriages because the social cost of leaving was too high. Alva refused to endure. Officially, she cited William's infidelity. The details didn't need to be spelled out. Everyone understood what that meant. But under the surface, the divorce was also an act of self-assertion. The same drive that had pushed her to force open the doors of high society now pushed her to reject a role that made her feel powerless and disrespected. Here's where Marble House plays a key role again. Years earlier, William had given Marble House to Alva as a birthday present. It was put in her name. At the time, it looked like a grand romantic gesture, a devoted husband gifting his wife a palace by the sea. But legally, that gift meant something else. When the marriage ended, Marble House was hers. The railroads might have made the money, but the deed to this particular symbol of that fortune belonged to Alva personally. William could walk away from the marriage, but he couldn't take back the palace he'd handed over as a token of love and pride. After the divorce, Alva remarried. Her second husband was Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, another wealthy figure from Newport society. He owned Belcourt, a large, somewhat eccentric mansion not far from Marble House. With Oliver, Alva moved to Belcourt and shifted the center of her life there. Marble House didn't disappear, but its role began to change. It was no longer the primary battlefield in her social war. It became something else, a symbol of what she had survived and a tool she could use in new ways. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The same woman who had once seemed fully focused on her own status and power began to reinvent herself as a political activist, specifically as a leader in the women's suffrage movement. It didn't happen overnight. Part of this shift grew from guilt and reflection. As she got older, Alva seemed to recognize the damage she'd caused to Consuelo by forcing her into an unwanted marriage. The image of mother as strategist began to crack, and she started to ask bigger questions about how much control women really had over their own lives. At the same time, the world around her was changing. More and more women were organizing, speaking, and demanding the right to vote. The suffrage movement was gaining momentum in both the U.S. and Britain. For some women of Alva's class, this movement was a chance to move beyond social games and use their influence for something larger. For Alva, activism offered something else too, a new stage. She threw herself into the cause with the same intensity she had once poured into parties and palaces. She donated money. She hosted events. She used her name, Vanderbilt, Belmont, Marble House, to draw attention. One of her most striking moves was turning part of Marble House into a literal platform for suffrage. On the grounds, near the edge of the property, she had a Chinese tea house built. A small, ornate building with sweeping roofs and bright colors, standing on its own terrace overlooking the sea. It looked like a decorative fantasy, a charming addition to an already dramatic estate. But Alva used it as a rallying point. Here, she hosted suffrage meetings and fundraisers. Well-dressed women gathered on the terrace, in the tea house, and in the surrounding gardens to hear speeches about voting rights and political power. Photographs from the time show umbrellas, hats, and banners, a strange, fascinating blend of elite fashion and radical ideas. The irony is hard to miss. A palace built on railroad money and unequal wealth, a place where servants moved like shadows, and a daughter had been maneuvered into a loveless marriage, was now being used as a headquarters for a movement about women's rights and political equality. But the story is messy, not simple. Alva's version of feminism was shaped by her class. She was fighting for women's votes, yes, but the movement she moved in was centered around women like herself. Wealthy, white, socially connected. Working-class women, women of color, and immigrant women were often at the margins of that conversation, even though they were the ones living with the harshest conditions. Still, it mattered. By tying Marble House to suffrage, Alva changed the meaning of the building, at least partly. It was no longer just a frozen monument to excess. It became a place where arguments were made, where minds were changed, where strategies were planned. The same terraces that had once hosted glittering parties now hosted political speeches. You can picture it. The ocean still there, the cliffs still holding firm, the marble still shining in the sun. But instead of waltzes and small talk, the air filled with words about laws, rights, and the future. Instead of everyone looking toward Alva as a hostess, they looked toward speakers and leaders who were trying to pull the country in a new direction. Did this transformation erase the darker history of Marble House? No. The exploited labor, the servants' invisible work, Consuelo's coerced marriage, none of that gets wiped away because rallies were held on the lawn. But it does make the story more complicated and more human. Alva Vanderbilt, later Alva Belmont, was not a simple villain or a simple hero. She was a woman shaped by her era, by her fears, and by her hunger for control, who eventually used the same tools she'd once wielded for personal gain to push for broader change. Marble House in her hands became both the symbol of a ruthless fortune and a stage for one of the most important political fights of the early 20th century. If you enjoy deep dives into stories where grand buildings hide complicated people, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments which Gilded Age mansion or powerful family you want us to investigate next. Fade of a dynasty, preservation, tourism, and sanitized memory. Every party ends, even Gilded Age parties. As the early 1900s rolled on, the world that created Marble House started to crack. New technologies, new politics, and new attitudes about wealth and work all began to eat away at the old order. Even the Vanderbilt fortune wasn't immune. The family still had money, but the days of endless building and spending were fading. High taxes, changing investment patterns, and the sheer cost of maintaining so many gigantic homes started to catch up with them. The idea of keeping a palace you only used for a few weeks every summer began to look less glamorous and more like a financial headache. Alva herself shifted more and more into activism and eventually spent much of her later life in France. By the time she died in 1933, the world she'd fought so hard to dominate was already disappearing. Marble House, though, was still sitting on its cliff. In 1936, the estate was sold to a new owner, Frederick H. Prince, a financier. For a while, Marble House became less of a social battlefield and more of a private trophy, a relic of a past era kept mostly intact, but no longer the center of a social season. Then came the Great Depression, World War II, and a very different America. By mid-century, a lot of the great Gilded Age mansions were being torn down. The huge houses on New York's Fifth Avenue, including some of the Vanderbilt palaces, were demolished and replaced with office towers and apartment blocks. Keeping them standing just didn't make sense anymore. They were too big, too expensive, too tied to a world that no longer existed. That could easily have been Marble House's fate. But it wasn't. In the 1960s, the Preservation Society of Newport County stepped in. They had already begun saving other important Newport cottages, like the Breakers, and they saw Marble House as a key piece of the puzzle, a physical record of the Gilded Age and the people who had shaped it. The Society acquired Marble House and began the process of turning it into what it is today, a museum house, open to the public. Over time, it was designated a National Historic Landmark. Restoration work shored up the structure, repaired details, and tried to bring rooms closer to their original appearance. The palace on the cliff, once a private fortress of status, became something very different, a tourist site. Today, thousands of visitors walk through those same marble halls every year. They follow audio guides or docents, learn about Alva and William, see the rooms where parties were held, and stand on the terraces looking out over the Atlantic. Photo after photo is taken. Gold ceilings, marble staircases, the Chinese tea house, the grand entrance. On one level, this is a good thing. Marble House survives. It hasn't been bulldozed or left to rot. People can see, with their own eyes, what Gilded Age wealth looked like. They can stand inside a story that might otherwise just be a paragraph in a history book. But there's another side to the way these places are preserved and presented. History can be edited. Tours have to make choices. You can't say everything in an hour. So what do you highlight? The architect's genius? The cost of the materials? The famous parties? The dresses and the dinnerware? And what gets pushed to the edges? Do visitors hear much about railway monopolies, rate wars, and the public be damned? Do they hear the details about quarry accidents and dust-clogged lungs? Do they get more than a passing mention of the servants' long days and cramped rooms? Do they hear the full, uncomfortable story of Consuelo's forced marriage, not just as gossip, but as an example of how even loved daughters could be sacrificed to strategy? Sometimes these things are mentioned, sometimes they're softened, sometimes they're framed as colorful background instead of central truths. The result can feel like a museum of surfaces. We see the marble and gold. We hear about society, but the deeper cost only flickers at the edges. There's also the modern layer of pop culture. Marble House, like other Newport mansions, has appeared in films, TV shows, and glossy magazines. It's used as a backdrop for wedding photos and period dramas. On social media, it often shows up as an aesthetic. Gilded Age, mansion, old money. Shots of staircases and chandeliers get likes and comments from people who may never hear the full story of how all that beauty was paid for. In that way, the house is still doing what it was built to do: impress. Only now, instead of impressing a few hundred people at a ball, it impresses millions of strangers scrolling on their phones. Instead of being a weapon in Alva's fight with the Astors, it's a piece of content, a backdrop that lets people imagine themselves in a world of gowns, gloves, and quiet, endless wealth. The Preservation Society has tried, more and more, to add depth, talking about servants, about labor, about the social context of the Gilded Age. But there's always a tension. Visitors come because the house is beautiful. Beautiful things are easier to celebrate than to question. So Marble House lives on in a kind of double life. In stone and official plaques, it's a masterpiece of American architecture, a prized landmark. In brochures and TV shots, it's a fantasy, a dream of a time when they just don't build them like this anymore. But if you look closely and listen carefully, it's also something else, a carefully curated memory, a story that still tends to center the people who had the most, not the ones who gave the most to keep it standing. The real cost of marble. What this palace still tells us. If you stand on the terrace of Marble House today, the ocean looks almost the same as it did in Alva's time. The waves still hit the rocks. The wind still cuts across the lawn. The house still stares out at the Atlantic like it owns the view. But everything else has changed. The Vanderbilts are gone. The servants are gone. The quarry workers are gone. The carriages have turned into buses, and the invited few have turned into ticketed crowds. So what's left? A lot of stone, a lot of stories, and a question. What did this place really cost? We can start with the obvious. Money. Marble House cost about $11 million in the late 1800s, including its furnishings. In today's money, that's hundreds of millions of dollars poured into a building that was only meant to be used for a small part of each year. Even by Gilded Age standards, it was extreme. That money could have gone 1,000 different ways. Building schools, hospitals, housing, better working conditions for employees across the railroad system. Instead, it went into marble walls, gold ceilings, carved wood, imported art, and a tea house by the sea. But money is only one layer of the cost. Look deeper, and you start to see the human bill. Quarry workers who risked their lives cutting stone from the earth, stonecutters and carvers who spent their days in dust and noise, shaping marble into decoration they would never live with. Servants who climbed the narrow back stairs, day after day, to keep the illusion of effortlessness intact. Their names are mostly gone from the record. At best, they show up in payrolls, census forms, or a passing mention in a letter. None of them had their initials carved in stone over the door. Yet without them, Marble House doesn't exist. Then there's the emotional cost inside the family. Alva's drive for status came out of real fear. Fear of losing security, of being pushed aside, of never being taken seriously by people who were born with more social power than she had. That fear pushed her to do impressive things, but also cruel things. She built a palace, but she also built a trap for her daughter. Consuelo's story shows what happens when human lives become chess pieces in a social game. Her marriage to the Duke of Marlborough wasn't just a romantic society tale. It was a transaction. Vanderbilt money to save an English estate, Vanderbilt daughter to secure a title. The emotional fallout of that deal lasted decades. It haunted both women. It shaped how Alva later saw herself and why she turned toward activism. It shaped how Consuelo understood her own life and choices. Marble House is the backdrop of that story, a beautiful cage in the early chapters, and a distant symbol in the later ones. There's also a social and political cost woven into the foundations. The money that paid for Marble House came from an economic system that treated workers as expendable, that allowed huge fortunes to pile up in the hands of a few, and that left many people struggling just to survive. Railroads were powerful engines of change, but they were also the site of some of the worst labor fights of the era. Every column in Marble House stands on that history. Even the good parts of the story are complicated. Alva's work for women's suffrage mattered. She used her resources to help push a movement forward. She turned her tea house and her name into tools for change. She helped shift public opinion at a time when women were still told to stay quiet and stay home. But that activism existed in tension with everything that came before it. The forced marriage, the obsession with rank, the blind spots about class and race. Marble House became a stage for a better future, built by someone who had caused real harm along the way. That mix, beauty and damage, progress and exploitation, is exactly what makes Marble House important now. Because if we're honest, we still build places like this. Today, they might not be marble palaces on Rhode Island cliffs. They might be glass towers, tech campuses, mega yachts, private islands, desert resorts, or giant compounds behind walls and gates. They might be ski chalets, super mansions in the hills above Los Angeles, or private estates hidden in wooded suburbs. They're funded by different industries: tech, finance, energy, entertainment, but the pattern feels familiar. Fortunes built on systems most people never fully see. Workers spread across the globe, doing dangerous or exhausting jobs far away from the final product. houses and projects that become symbols, statements, ways to say, "I made it," in a world where inequality is still huge. Just like Marble House, these modern status symbols are easy to admire at a distance. Drone shots, magazine, spreads, social media posts, everything framed to show the beauty and none of the cost. But if Marble House teaches us anything, it's this. You can't separate the beauty from the cost. The marble, the gold, the view, they're all connected to choices made about money, power, and people. If we only look at the surface, we're basically doing what polite Gilded Age society did, enjoying the show and trying not to think too hard about the backstage. So what do we do with a place like Marble House now? We can't undo its history. We can't pay back the quarry workers or give the servants their time back. We can't rewrite Consuelo's early life. But we can choose how we look at it. Instead of treating it like a fantasy, we can treat it like evidence. A case study in what happens when wealth runs almost unchecked. A reminder that behind every impressive structure, there's a chain of people, some powerful, some powerless, whose lives intersected in ways that weren't always fair. If you ever visit Marble House, here's one way to walk through it. Admire the craftsmanship. It really is extraordinary. But then in every room, ask yourself, who built this? Who cleaned this? Who paid for this with something they never really got back? Look up at the decorated ceilings, and then look for the servant bell pulls. Walk the grand staircase, and imagine the back stairs. Stand on the terrace, and remember that this view was once reserved for a tiny group of people, guarded by walls, money, and social rules. On this channel, we try to do exactly that. Take beautiful, impressive places and ask the uncomfortable questions hiding underneath them. If you enjoy deep investigations into mansions, mega projects, and powerful families, and the real cost behind their dreams, please like this video and subscribe. It helps us keep telling stories that don't stop at the surface. In the end, Marble House is more than a Gilded Age postcard. It's a mirror. When we look into it, we don't just see the Vanderbilts and their world. We see ourselves. We see the buildings we celebrate now, the fortunes we admire, the red carpet lifestyles we watch online. And we have to ask, how different are we, really, from the people who once danced under these chandeliers? What are our marble houses, and who is paying for them? This has been The Dark Story of Marble House, the Vanderbilt Palace built on ruthless fortune.